Welcome to Headliners Forum. We're here to bring you the best in Texas journalism, the stories behind the great stories. I'm your host, Mark Morrison. Our special guests are Uriel Garcia of the Texas Tribune and Lomi Kriel, a member of the Tribune and ProPublica's shared investigative unit. They were part of a huge reporting effort by dozens of staffers from the Tribune, ProPublica, and the Washington Post, who won this year's Headliners Foundation Showcase Gold Award for impactful investigative reporting. The staffs partnered to cover one of the biggest stories ever in Texas and nationally, the May 2022 shootings at a Uvalde elementary school took the lives of 19 students and 2 adults and became the focus of the entire nation for months. Uriel and Lomi, congratulations on your great work and welcome to Headliners Forum.
Thank you.
At the outset, Uriel, Uvalde was a giant news story and an all-hands-on-deck undertaking for the Tribune. Recall for us those early days of you and your fellow reporters responding and filing their first stories.
Yeah, I'll be frank, I was off that the day of the shooting, but I did go back when I got back to work and the following week, and there was still a lot of tension in Uvalde when I got there. There was still a lot of uncertainty from the families as to how to interact with journalists. And it's a small town, and it's a town that gets overlooked a lot. So like I said, there was a lot of tension, and not just from the residents themselves, but for me myself, I didn't know how to approach families initially, just because even though this was probably my third mass shooting as a journalist, we were talking about children, and I knew that right away I had to rethink how I do my reporting process when it comes to a mass shooting.
And what was your approach as you proceeded to cover it?
Initially, we did not approach any of the families immediately. We sort of had rotating reporters going back and forth from Austin, and I'm based in El Paso, so I was going from El Paso. And, I just sort of started meeting people, going to public meetings, just listening in on some of the grievances that the families and residents had about the fallout. And, I would approach the families in public, and I would tell them who I was. I would ask them if they were interested in getting to know each other down the road. I wouldn't necessarily immediately interview them right on the spot. I just told them we're going to be here for a while, and we're going to be here for the long-term stories, and I'd like to hear their feedback when that time comes.
Right. Lomi, in those first few days, what are your recollections? And it soon became obvious to the team that this tragic event needed to be covered as an investigative project, not just a comprehensive news report.
Yeah, so I mean, those first few days, I just remember how crazy it was. We have a joint Slack with the Texas Tribune and ProPublica, and it was just, I mean, we've had, like Uriel, I've covered 3 or 4 mass shootings, but something about obviously the children, the age of the children, and the confusion over the law enforcement response that carried on for weeks after the fact, and frankly remains that same way today, made it very clear to us pretty immediately that this would require some more digging. It was very difficult to sort of envision how that would take place, because the state and almost all the agencies involved were incredibly non-responsive. I began asking questions about DPS's involvement, I think, like that first few days after the fact, because we had been covering Operation Lone Star and knew that there would be a fairly significant number of DPS officers in Uvalde, and there had been no mention of their role that day. So that ended up taking a lot of time. And it wasn't until a few months later that me and my colleague, Zach Daspart, was the first news organization to really look at DPS's role at Uvalde. And then, you know, along with Uriel and some of our other colleagues, that just sort of kept spiraling as we obtained more information. But it really was, despite you know, all the agencies stonewalling us. So it was an incredibly difficult and lengthy process to really get any information.
Yeah. Uriel, we know now that Uvalde was made worse by some needless delays by responders and some downright bungling by officials, but that was not apparent from a steady flow of misinformation and blame shifting. And sometimes officials themselves had a hard time finding the actual facts that they were trying to pass along to the public. How hard was it to break through and find out what really happened that day?
Yeah, I mean, it was months of work, right? And just building up trust with not just the residents themselves, but sources that were looking at our work and the type of work that we were doing. And you know, I think that that led to some of the sources giving us the information that we needed to be able to determine what happened that day. And you know, we weren't necessarily covering every little turn of the screw, if you will, but we were listening, we were paying attention, and like I said earlier, just going down there and just making sure that the Tribune and ProPublica's name was out there, I think really went a long way as far as getting trust from sources and giving us information that we needed. So, you know, it wasn't just one or two reporters. Obviously, you know, you're talking to me and Lomi, but you know, it's the team, the ProPublica team in Texas, and the whole team at the Tribune. Everyone from the audience team to people, the way they marketed our stories out to the public, I think really showed that, you know, we really wanted to get down to the bottom of what was going on. And I think people with the information noticed that and said, okay, I think, you know, we can trust with the Tribune and ProPublica with this information.
Lomi, as the project gained momentum and really went on for months and months, how did you and the team try to get through some of the stonewalling by officials?
Yeah, so like I said, and as Uriel just said, it was really difficult. I mean, I think it was really a multi-pronged effort, with Uriel being one of our key people on the ground, building trust with the community, and then reporters in many other roles, you know, like I said, Zach and I asking DPS, other reporters, just really just putting the word out there, putting the questions out there. As part of this, the Texas Tribune, ProPublica, and a coalition of other news organizations sued the state to try get records that were being completely withheld from us. We believe unjustly so, and a judge in Travis County has agreed with us fairly recently. So anticipate that, you know, hopefully we'll get some of those records at some point, although that's still being worked out legally. But in the meantime, as Uriel said, you know, we were just doing so many different facets trying to get at what happened that day. And in the course of that, we were able to obtain some confidential information that included body camera interviews and investigative body camera footage and investigative interviews with some of the key folks at the scene. And this was incredibly important. It helped us to do several stories that I think we were really on the front ground of doing this reporting, that really gave people a better look at, you know, for example, the 911 calls that day, which was never released publicly, even though that is a thing that is public. And we were able to really hone in that law enforcement should have known about a key, you know, a 911 call from a girl inside one of the classrooms saying that there's children and teachers dying in there. We also did, you know, a really intensive collaboration with the Washington Post that Uriel was also keenly involved in, that looked at the medical response. This is information that would have been very difficult to obtain otherwise, but we were able to, I think, pretty compellingly pose the question that there's a possibility some victims may have survived had the law enforcement response not taken more than 77 minutes, and then additional delays with EMS and medical workers. So I think that was very, very key to our reporting, and is an investigation that is ongoing. The Travis County Medical Examiner is overseeing that medical probe right now in terms of, if people could have been saved. And obviously it's devastating.
Yeah. And as it moved along, I mean, all of the persistence and digging that you and the staff did, still at the end of the day needed to file more than 100 formal information requests, and there were at least a couple of lawsuits versus the Texas Rangers and the DPS trying to get to the bottom of the story. Uriel, it's now 15 months later, and what do you consider the biggest breakthroughs that the team made so that readers and viewers could get the important takeaways from Uvalde?
Yeah, I mean, for a lot of, the general public doesn't necessarily know about how records requests work or public meetings and things like that, right? And I think that a lot of parents, when I was down there, had mentioned to me, I wish I would have been more involved now, or I wish I would have been more involved before the shooting. I wish I would have been going to the school board meetings. I wish I would have known some of the training that police officers had, things like this. And I think one of the things that we did as far as educating the public is that we really, I think, showed what is public record and what the parents have a right to. Something that parents have told me sometimes they have no access or have a hard time accessing certain things that they wish they had. And, one of the key takeaways that I got from the parents, and it stays with me, is that the parents, rightfully so, don't necessarily want journalists down there, but they've seen the value of journalism. And one thing that a parent told me was that, they want to trust the prosecutor overseeing this case. But what he told me was that the only time any sort of information becomes public is when journalists are sniffing around. And, that made me feel like, initially, when I was there, I didn't feel good probing around so much, invading people's privacy. But when I heard that from the parent, it made me feel like we are doing a public service here. And I think ultimately that was the big takeaway, is that if it weren't for journalists doing this, who knows when we would have found out about the delays, not just from the law enforcement, but as well as from the medical response team.
Yeah, one of the techniques you used, along with great photography and video and audio, were timelines that really showed the reader step by step what happened and in sequence. Tell us about developing those, and I believe the Washington Post was partnering with you on some of the work, forensics on photos and videos, and helping tell this story.
Yeah, I think, when we got the information, when Texas Tribune and ProPublica got the information, Washington Post wanted to partner up with the Tribune and try to do something in depth. And it happened very organically. We got the information at the same time that the Washington Post had reached out to us. And while I was on the ground with some of with the Washington Post team, is when we had found out, okay, we have this information. How do we share it? It's very delicate information, so we have to be careful. And part of the reason why we were worried initially is, if we share it to a wider net of journalists, is this going to leak? Is this going to harm our relationships with the families if something gets released that's too delicate for public consumption. And so, we had to tread carefully here. And like I said, at least for me, I had to rethink some of my reporting techniques and how to navigate different personalities at the same time. Ultimately, it all worked out. And I think what I reminded myself is that we all have similar goals, which is, be transparent with the community as to what we have and be responsible with the information we had.
Right. Lomi, unfortunately, there were many tragic shooting events before and after Uvalde, but Uvalde and your coverage resonated with the public and decision makers in a very special way. Tell us about the impact you had on the Texas Ledge and Congress, and getting kind of some of the rules of the road changed.
Yeah, so I want to echo what Uriel said. I think the number one impact is, just really had journalists not been digging into this, who knows, we may still have the same timeline that is now wrong that, DPS first gave us in their first press conference. So, I mean, I think that the number one impact is that through this team effort, we have resulted in some answers and some questions. And as Uriel said, the families have no information. And so just providing them any information about what happened that day is probably number one on the list. But that said, I mean, yes, because of the coverage, because of the just horrific events and nature of the response that day, there were multiple attempts to make changes. Probably most notable is a slew of bills by Senator Gutierrez, who represents Uvalde. He's a Democrat, and he filed a bunch of bills, including one that was directly related to our medical response story that would have addressed some of the issues we raised there and tried to provide more training and better radio communication. Unfortunately, none of those bills gained much traction. But there were a couple of other significant legislation efforts that did pass. One significant one is that all law enforcement in Texas is now required to take 16 hours of active shooter training every 2 years. This actually puts it at the head of the country. No other state requires this kind of ongoing training, so it's pretty significant. But unfortunately, in the case of Uvalde, it comes a little bit too late. But I mean, I think everyone agrees that having more training for officers on this particular aspect is good. There's also more attempts at school safety, which, also happened after Santa Fe. So that has sort of enhanced some of those efforts. And then there was a huge effort to attempt to raise the age for assault rifles from 18 to 21. This is something that the families in Uvalde are incredibly passionate about. And they were able to actually get this to the most advanced step yet, which they had a committee hearing pretty late in the session. But unfortunately, this never made it to the State House. But that is, still, I mean, I guess we'll see what happens with that next session. On the federal front, there were also some attempts, like, we've seen after other events like Sandy Hook, to kind of change gun legislation. But unfortunately, most of that didn't pass, although Congress did pass a bill that basically enhanced background checks for gun buyers under 18. So the kind of short version is that there were a lot of attempts to make changes. There were some changes, most notably with training and background checks. But in terms of the big picture items that the families wanted, those didn't happen.
Yeah. And Uriel, school districts around the state are making reforms, and they're still making some changes as they get ready for schools starting in the weeks ahead. what is the challenge they face, and are schools becoming safer?
You know, that's a hard question to answer, just because there's a lot of fundamental questions that still need to be answered in the Uvalde case, right? We haven't talked about mental health care. I mean, mental health is a big issue that goes hand in hand with gun control laws. And in the case of Uvalde, we know certain things about the shooter that may have, that indicate that he was really mentally unstable, and we just don't know why he didn't get the help that he needed to help. Going back to your question, as our schools becoming safer, I think they're doing everything that they can to be able to prevent another shooting. But what gets missed a lot in this conversation is the mental health and well-being of the general student population. Do they have the resources to be able to vent frustrations or any troubles that they may be having at home? Do they have somewhere safe at school to be able to talk about this? And so, you know, we would like to think that they're becoming safer, but at the same time, we also know that social services like mental health care aren't being invested in as much as you know, the physical things of reinforcing the buildings, or adding fencing, or adding locks, or routinely check that the locks are working. The fundamental issue here is, are the student population, how is their well-being, and are we investing in the mental health care that they need as well? And I don't think that we are.
Yeah, and Lomi, some of the you know, some of the politicians particularly have been pushing for training of teachers and other staff members at schools to basically be fortified for these kinds of incidents. And then there's the whole other course of hiring new law enforcement people and placing them in the schools. How is that all unfolding?
Yeah, so I think it still kind of basically remains to be seen. I mean, this is like, these bills just went into effect. Uvalde kids went back to school in Uvalde on Monday, San Antonio on Monday. So, you know, I think a lot of this hiring and attempts to have these staffing up and comply with those requirements are still a work in progress. I do know that particularly in Uvalde, it's been very difficult to hire law enforcement, which is also understandable because, you know, I mean, all of the more than 300 agents who responded that day, we still don't have answers, and there's a call for potential criminal charges there against some of them. So, you know, I think this is a really difficult and nuanced problem that involves like a lot of different facets, and I think we're just going to have to see how it goes. The other unfortunate thing that happened is last week the cousin of the gunman was arrested for allegedly making some threats. It was a kind of mental health situation as well, but that didn't really help in terms of back to school this week for everyone, because that immediately put the alert, right? Like, I mean, in Uvalde, San Antonio, I know like officers were called to, parents are very afraid to send their kids back. So anyway, the point is, I think we still don't know.
Yeah. Teamwork was obviously something that made this project work so well, because you had so many people pulling together to put together your stories and get them to the public, not only within, of course, the Tribune staff, but the other news organizations that were involved. I want to ask both of you. Let's start with Lomi about what you experienced with working as part of that team, and such a large team with a very complicated agenda of covering all these stories.
Yeah, so as part of the ProPublica Texas Tribune investigative team, we do work very closely with the Tribune. Most of the stories that we did here were, like I said, with my colleague Zach, with Alejandro, and with Uriel. What kind of added a new wrinkle was when we collaborated with the Washington Post, which added, 4 or 5 reporters and maybe like 6 editors. I think at one point we were in our document and there were about 45 people in the document, and also included, just editors, visual folks, so audience folks, standards people, photography people. So this was certainly for me, and I think for most people, a very unique collaboration. I think it worked out really well, and mostly it worked out incredibly well once the reporters were able to actually just start doing their work together, right? These are things that happen best like organically, and once you're able to kind of gain a bit of trust with your colleagues and you know that you're all on the same page, but it's certainly not easy.
And Uriel, your recollections of working with such a big and effective team.
Yeah, I mean, like Lomi said, it was difficult initially at first, being introduced to a new team with the Washington Post. We don't know, there's personalities involved, like any big project in any industry, right? When you have so many people working on one project, you have to navigate those personalities. Like I said, the way I got through it is, I try to sort of through comic relief with some of the people that I worked at the Washington Post on the ground, just spending time with them after our interviews, and just sharing what we liked about the hobbies we liked about each other. Do you know what I mean? And the point is that we try to have fun together, so that when we got down to work, we knew what we were doing, we got along, and we knew that whenever we were frustrated, it wasn't personal. It was the subject matter, and it was a stressful thing to do. Not just because we're trying to meet deadlines, but seeing some of the information, seeing some of the images, seeing some of the video, it took, I'm not going to pretend to know what those families felt, but anyone objectively speaking, seeing the images that we saw does take some toll on your emotional state and your mental stability as well. Like I said, at the end of the day, it was just trying to get along with everyone, and trying to find some joy in the quiet times, at least for me, when I was working with the team on the ground. And so that's how I worked. And I mean, I already worked with Zach and Lomi and Alejandro, that, they're my coworkers. So it was easier to get along with them, but trying to create some sort of a professional relationship with another group at the Washington Post was, like I said, stressful, but we all got along at the end of the day.
Our judges agreed with the editors that you were able to lean into vast experience on politics and public policy to provide immediate context for readers and respectful, compassionate coverage of the community. You effectively used every multimedia tool to provide an original and inside look at all the many facets of the Uvalde tragedy, and you had a profound impact on the audience and on officials. Congratulations again on the team's remarkable journalism.
Thank you so much, and we really appreciate this honor. It means a lot.
On our site, headlinersfoundation.org, you can link to the award-winning Uvalde stories and to interviews with other outstanding Texas journalists. For my colleague and Headliners Forum producer, Gary Pickle, I'm Mark Morrison.